Welcome to Coffee Moguls, a new podcast exploring entrepreneurship, coding, and business. I'm Nathan LeClaire, a hacker by trade and by passion, slinging code by day and doing business by night, who is also endlessly fascinated by the world of trends and what's going on in the economy. I'm very pleased to welcome to the show today a special guest in my heart, which is Mr. Zak Bushon. And I'm very excited because I think he's going to give a really unique perspective about what's happening out there on Main Street and what's happening out there with millennials, people my age, the average individual. And one of the things that frustrates me endlessly with existing podcasts is a lot of the folks that are on there pontificating, while they're very bright, they often live in their own bubbles and echo chambers of memes. And some of the things we'll talk about today are how some of these memes out there are just not accurate. And so, without spoiling too much, I'd like to introduce Mr. Zak Bushon. How's it going, Zak?
It's going well. How are you doing today, Nathan?
I'm doing well. We're reporting live from Louisville, Kentucky, my hometown, and this is just great. We can actually sit in the same room together and record the podcast. Usually, I would be just kind of sitting by myself.
Right. Well, it's nice with kind of everything reopening after 2020. It's nice to be in the same room again. And I guess that's why you brought me on today. I've worked in the restaurant industry for years and years. I've been a sales rep for a brewery. I worked for the same company for right at almost 4 years when I was a month shy when we went into COVID lockdown. I actually spent most of 2020 on unemployment and sitting around just watching Netflix on unemployment. But I did want to kind of talk about, I guess, some of the misconceptions about people who sat on unemployment for months and months. Really, the main one that's going on now that bothers me is this idea that no one wants to work and people are just sitting around on unemployment, which just isn't true. Um, I know Kentucky, for one, has reinstituted their work requirements. So we're back to having to apply for a certain number of jobs a week just to keep your unemployment. And if you turn down a job, you can't keep your unemployment. So that idea that no one wants to work really frustrates me.
Right. Yeah. So that's exactly what I wanted to get into. And so, like you mentioned, one of these memes that's been flying around everywhere, I don't know the exact origin, although I have some guesses, but I do think has been copied and repeated again and again and again. Even we were out at the bar last night and almost just completely unsolicited in an unrelated comment, one of these guys that we were talking to said, "Oh, well, why would anyone want to work when the government's just cutting them a blank check?"
Right.
And I've just heard that again and again and again lately in all sorts of different areas. You can kind of take a guess at the demographics of the people who say that a lot. But at any rate, let's get into that. So tell me a little bit first about your story before we start tearing into this and essentially saying, I don't think that's really a very accurate reflection of what's going on out there.
Yeah.
Tell us about what happened with you.
Well, so 2020 would have been March. We were internally having a discussion. Really, the NBA shutting down was the big one for us, being in the restaurant industry. And I worked at a place that was in a baseball stadium. So, I mean, we saw thousands of people a day. It was a really high volume kind of place. We had kind of reduced our capacity, but the NBA shutting down their season was the thing that made us go, oh, wow, like if they're willing to let go of that money, like what does that mean? I went to work on a Sunday and my bosses came in for an emergency meeting and they pulled the 5 of us who were working that day. And then we got on a conference call with some other people and we collectively, as a company, made the decision to shut down. At that point, our thinking was that it would be for a handful of weeks, perhaps.
Right. And this was like March 2020.
Yeah, it was like the day after St. Patrick's Day, actually.
There you go.
I remember because that was one of the things that had stressed us out was seeing all the videos and stuff of all the crowds. And then we had to go. Those are the same people who are coming to the restaurant the next day.
Right.
And that kind of stressed us out. Like one of my coworkers is immunocompromised. So he was stressed about having to bartend. This was before the mask wearing recommendations or before there were really any recommendations on how to protect yourself. So
that's right. Like everything was just all over the place at that point. And especially here in Kentucky, it tends to be a little more conservative. And so people, while it's unfortunate that mask versus non-mask debate got split along political lines, that might help paint the picture of what it was like for the listeners.
Right. But we felt like sitting ducks. 70% of our credit card traffic in any given year is out of towners. The majority of our business are travelers. We were a bit of a tourist destination. So that that in and of itself, where it's like, oh, our entire business model is greeting people from other states at a time where you probably shouldn't be traveling that much. But so they shut us down, or I guess you could say we shut ourselves down, because we shut down a couple days before the announcement even came down from the state. But first, I mean, my bosses were pretty good. They had a lot of perishables and that sort of thing. So they basically just started boxing them up and handing them out to us. So they'd put a thing on Facebook where it'd be like, hey, come down to the restaurant between 4 and 5 and get a box of vegetables and a gallon of milk. That sort of thing. So they were giving us free food. With the toilet paper shortage, they gave us toilet paper because we had a restaurant full of toilet paper rolls, that sort of thing. Part of it was getting rid of the perishables, but I do want to give them credit to say that I think part of it was also just them trying to help us out. Because this was also, even going back to the unemployment thing, so a lot of people may not realize you have to apply for unemployment. It takes about a week or so for it to get approved, and then assuming it does get approved, you then apply for your first payment 2 weeks later, and it'll take a few days after you apply. So that was where we were getting laid off, and even if you qualified for unemployment, you weren't going to see a check for a month. Do you know what I mean? And not a lot of us had necessarily prepared to not work for a month,
Right.
Out of the blue. So that was helpful as well, where they were giving us free food and helping us stretch our dollars a little bit. And so, I credit where credit is due. But I feel like one of the things that kind of highlights the conflict between like an hourly wage worker and technically a medium-sized business owner is what ended up happening in June, where they tried to reopen and it was still at a limited capacity and most of it was outdoor. But this is a right to work state. So they presented this false choice that is either go back to work or lose your benefits. So they handed me a blank contract that said I would return to work at my old salary, and the return to work date was blank. And they wanted me to sign it and give it back to them, and they would fill in the return to work date after I had signed the contract.
Right. So to summarize, in March 2020, you were laid off from your job. No one knew what was going to happen. You applied for unemployment and got it, I think. Right?
Correct. But
yeah.
I mean, the first check didn't come in until April.
Right. And it took a while.
Right.
And so it wasn't just like the government automatically deposited money in your bank account. It took some time for them to vet it. And that was even, I think we can get into this in a second, but that was the fast round. You said eventually it got even slower. So you were laid off. Everything was up in the air. And then I think it was kind of like in June. So 2 months later, the company insisted that you come back to work in the midst of still great COVID uncertainty.
Correct.
This was 2020 in June, where we were all still cowering inside our houses, essentially.
Well, and we were a restaurant downtown, and that was this would have been 3 weeks after the protests started, because our protest started with the George Floyd protests.
Right. Yes, and we'll talk a little bit about this later. But like Louisville is exploding politically at the same time.
Yes.
And even right outside the door of the business, I think, in some cases. Yeah. So
but
that all was going on as well. And you sort of got an ultimatum where you had to go back to work or you didn't get any unemployment anymore, as it's meant to work.
Yes.
That's how unemployment is meant to work. So then, okay, and your company, though, kind of presented this asymmetric document that had a blank box and asked you to sign this contract, essentially under threat of losing your unemployment. And then what happened?
Well, so I ended up going back to work. I mean, I really didn't have a choice. It was either go back to work there or find a new job. And I mean, at that point, taking my old job, because I couldn't stay on unemployment, I couldn't say no. Like literally, there was no real choice there. So go back to work in June, and we're open for about 3 weeks a month. And they met with their accountant and decided that they were going to close again on July 1st. And so then, they closed again because with the reduced capacity, we just weren't doing the volume to keep the restaurant open. And so then they put us all back on unemployment after just forcing us off. And again, that's where I had closed my unemployment account because I went back to work. So then I had to reopen it. So I had to reapply. And then I had to wait for it to get accepted. And then I had to wait 2 weeks. So then they closed the restaurant again on July 1st. I went back on unemployment and didn't get an unemployment check until August.
Right. So much more of a lag to it. And unlike this meme where people just act like you walk into a government office, they hand you
They were
an
closed.
envelope full of cash.
Yeah, offices were closed. You couldn't even go to the office to try to troubleshoot or anything.
Right. And so not exactly the easiest thing in the world. And so this kind of whiplash, the company bringing you back under duress almost, where you didn't have much of a choice, even though it was the middle of a deadly pandemic, and then
Well, and
suddenly laying you all off again in 6 weeks after they brought you back. Is that common? Was that a trend with all the people you knew?
Oh yeah, that happened with a lot of people. And it's worth noting that my position, especially the one they brought me back at, because I would do some traveling, like sales rep beer festival kind of stuff, and none of that was going on. So when they brought me back, the only work they were bringing me back for was the tipped work in the restaurant. And so then that's where it's like you're talking about bringing someone back who technically on paper makes $2.13 an hour, and the rest of their wages are made up in tips, and you're bringing them back to a restaurant that's operating at 25% capacity. And there's just not that many people going out to restaurants.
That's right. So. And actually, let me just stop you there. I think this is a really important point that a lot of people are missing in this meme, which we're sort of now in the middle of tearing into it, about how everybody's too lazy and they're getting a government unemployment check, and that's why we have a labor shortage. These people, if they're working for tips, they're making like $2 an hour, right?
Yeah. They raised the minimum wage in Louisville to $10 an hour a couple of years ago, but they carved out a specific exemption for restaurant employees because we're such a hospitality-based city. And on the one hand, it helps keep overhead low, which makes it easier to start restaurants, and there's a lot of really good local restaurants around here. The flip side is that, you're 28 years old and you make $2 an hour.
Right. And so, yeah, in the good times, I do think that was the trade-off that you would often make. And you sort of thought the numbers are in my favor because the restaurant is going to inevitably have a lot of business. This was pre-COVID times. Correct. And then while some people might not tip amazing, you would sometimes get those fatty tips that would really help you a lot.
Well, and it was a very popular restaurant. It was a high volume restaurant. It's worth pointing out. So I qualified for the maximum unemployment here in Kentucky, which was based on your salary, right? How much money you were making. So I qualified for the maximum and then the additional 300, which means, and then I elected to have the taxes taken out. So, I'm losing whatever 12% or whatever of it right up front because I'm prepaying the taxes because I don't want to, at this point, I don't want to get a big bill from the government the following year because I'm not working. But so it's worth noting, even with the extended unemployment that came out to before the taxes, about $600 every other week, which is less than I made at my job. Like that wasn't, you know what I mean? Like certainly better than just getting 300, but all it really helped me do was maintain my lifestyle. And I ended up suspending my car insurance because I wasn't driving anywhere, and it saved me $130 a month or whatever. So I trimmed a little bit of the fat out of the budget, but it essentially just allowed me to keep my lifestyle. Like it wasn't like it wasn't a bonanza. You know what I mean? Right. I wasn't just. It's not like my take home suddenly doubled or anything like that.
You're partying all the time, correct. And the unemployment was so great that why would you ever go back to work? Correct. Because you're making more sitting around than if you made at the restaurant. But it's also true though that, well, one thing that we should talk about is that you did eventually get off unemployment, and that's another issue with the way that people are seeing this is that you haven't been on unemployment for a long time. Right. So this argument that people are sitting around collecting unemployment and that's why they don't want to go back to work is partially bullshit because we just know, at least from the anecdata, that people just stopped collecting unemployment at a certain point. Yeah.
Well, and I guess there was a bunch of fraud. So they changed the system and they closed everyone's account and you had to reapply. And I think that did two things. One, I know for sure because this was my case, it created a shit show. And I basically just couldn't get through the computer portal to requalify. I mean, I actually spent almost 6 weeks where I would wake up in the morning, call the unemployment office. I would get this automated message that's like, oh, like hit 1 to leave your number on a list and we'll call you back when we get to you. And then at about 7:30 every night, I would get a robocall that's like, we didn't get to you today, but your name is still on the list. And then I would wake up the next morning, call, put my number on the list, and then get the robocall at 7:30. I did that for almost 6 straight weeks, and literally never once talked to a real person. like just caught in this loop, couldn't get anyone on the phone, online portal wasn't working, and it was because they had revamped everything for these the fraud things. So I think the second part of that is it creates an artificial lowering of the numbers. It's not that people got off unemployment, it's that they kicked people off and then people couldn't get back on. So then you go, oh, look, the unemployment numbers fell in December. Yeah, but not because people went back to work. Like, I think that's worth noting.
Right. People just got off unemployment.
Right.
Yeah. Right. And so that's another issue with this that we talked about. And so what are, all these people got off unemployment, but they're not going back to their jobs as cooks and servers and bartenders, Zach. So what are they doing?
They're doing a lot of different things. And I think that the company that I used to work for is a good example where everyone got laid off again in June or in July. And when we got laid off that point, because when we got laid off the first time, there was an implication of this is temporary and we'll all be back. When we got laid off the second time, it was very much, they literally sent a memo that was like, maybe spring 2021, like we'll see, right? Like, because again, this is 4 or 5 months before the vaccines come out. So
no one even had any idea that we could be doing this forever.
Right.
Yeah.
So then the second layoff was a much more open-ended kind of thing. And going into winter and that sort of thing. So there were more than a few people who kept working. I had some coworkers who went to work at the bars that were still open or went to work at other restaurants that were still open. But a lot of people retrained themselves. Like they took the opportunity while they were on unemployment. They took the opportunity to retrain themselves. I had one coworker who started a carpentry business. I have another coworker who went back and finished her nursing associate's degree. I have another coworker who went to salon hair school. And so it's worth noting that now they're trying to reopen the restaurant, and no one from the old team wants to go back to work for them. But it's not because they're all sitting on unemployment and don't want to work. It's that they moved on. And that's kind of worth noting. I don't know, say 40 people I used to work with, 3 of them are going back to work at the old job. The rest of them had moved on, but none of them are on unemployment.
Right. And you even said, I think they went first to their top pick to be the manager when they reopened. And then they had to go through a couple different people before they could find anyone who would do it.
Yeah. They had to literally, they just started going down the chain where, and that's a whole separate thing, but they ended up firing their head chef shortly after the pandemic started. That's a whole personnel thing.
Right.
He had worked there for more than
the standard challenges of business.
Right. He wasn't, and I wasn't involved in that, so I can't speak on it. But, so they had fired him. They weren't bringing him back. So they went to the assistant manager and offered him the job. And he turned it down because he was already the head manager at another restaurant, and had been for a couple months. So he stayed where he was. So then they went to the shift lead and they said, hey, do you want to be the manager? And he turned him down. And he's got 2 or 3 jobs. He's that guy's all over the place. Yeah. And I think that speaks more to not wanting to go work for minimum wage or not wanting to go work for a job that you have no benefits or anything like that. And none of these people turned down that offer to stay on unemployment. And in fact, being a right to work state, you're not even allowed to do that. They can't do that even. That's impossible.
Right.
So.
Right. So I enjoy that. I feel like that's a bit of an American dream that there's sort of this new phoenix rising from the ashes where these people are going off and becoming white collar workers or getting training on new activities or starting businesses. And what do you think will happen? I think one thing, for instance, that will happen is that wages have to increase. They have to go up.
They have to. Well, but what I see in my area is the wages are going up. And actually, it actually relates back to the right to work thing. Another anecdotal story that I think kind of highlights the issue. So they brought back one of my coworkers to work at another location, and I'm not sure exactly when, but it would have been wintertime, February or March maybe. And so they brought her back, and because they had this right to work contract, they brought her back at her original salary. And she ended up quitting a few weeks later because she found out that they were hiring the new hires at a higher wage because they had
much
to,
higher,
right,
right? Yeah.
right, because they had to raise the wage to be competitive, but because they had this right to work contract that she had signed, they didn't have to raise. You know what I mean? They could pay her the old rate.
She essentially just went and got another job across the street for an
Oh
increased
yeah,
rate, right?
Well,
Yeah.
Actually, that's literally what happened. Like she literally went to the brewery down the street and got the same job at that brewery for a higher wage.
Like, it wasn't even difficult.
Yeah, no, because there's a labor shortage. There's jobs everywhere.
The pressure is so strong. Yeah. So we've dove into all the reasons why we think that this meme that keeps getting repeated, that people are not going back to work because they'd rather get paid by the government, is wrong. Any closing thoughts on that particular topic?
Just kind of common sense in the idea that, like, even working at the restaurant is why we had fun doing it. You know what I mean? For all the nonsense that comes with it, we enjoyed working with each other, and we enjoyed the fast pace, and we enjoyed working hard. And so when you talk about those sorts of folks, like most of them, I don't want to say all, but I mean the vast, vast, vast majority of them want to work. Like they want to do something. Like they're people who like being busy. They're people who like being on their feet. They're people who like working with their hands. They're not people.
Right. They worked in a restaurant, for Christ's sake.
Yeah.
Right?
For a year. And I mean, and this was a restaurant where there wasn't a lot of turnover. You know what I mean? I worked with essentially the same group of people for 4 years.
Right.
Like it was a place.
That's another thing we were discussing last night, was that one of the problems that these businesses are having is that pseudo family environment has been shattered.
Yeah. I worked at a place where I had at least a half dozen coworkers who have the company logo tattooed on themselves. Like, and that's the level that we're talking about here, is the guy who's got the company logo tattooed on his ankle doesn't want to go work for the company anymore. Like, because he started a carpentry business. Like that, like he just, he made a big wooden like piece and sold it to the Marriott. It's hanging in the Marriott downtown. And they paid him $10,000 for it. And he just built a stage last weekend. He was building a stage for this outdoor music festival that was going on. Like, you know what I mean? Like he's busy. He's doing stuff. Like, but he's not going back to work for Against the Grain, even though he's got the logo tattooed on him. Like,
yeah. And there was actually another funny story, just as one closing thought on that view from Main Street in terms of employment, unemployment, and working in hospitality. I found it pretty funny and whimsical that at least for a while there was a promotion that Against the Grain had, and we'll plug Against the Grain in the description. Yeah. They had a promotion where if you got their logo tattooed on you, you would get a free beer on every visit.
Yes. So a lot of the employees,
people had them.
A lot of the employees got the logo because you got a free beer with every shift. So then if you had the tattoo, you get 2 free beers every time you walk in the building.
That's pretty good. I mean, it's pretty great that they have the markup to do that.
Yeah. And just to clarify, because like you said, plugging Against the Grain, I do like them as a company, and I don't mean to trash talk them, because I think it's important to note, I don't think that they did anything particularly untoward. I think they did something that is very much just standard operating procedure for a lot of business.
Correct. That's why I wanted to talk about it, because I think that you can extrapolate out and say this wasn't this one company. This was a lot of people.
And that's what I mean. It's a right to work state. We're not talking about a corporate policy. We're talking about the laws that apply to everyone around here.
Right. Yeah. And so I think that's something that software people should start doing. I think we need to do more fun promotions like that involve tattoos or something like that, a little more fun, because I think that's something I'll adopt. When I ship this project that I've been working on, if you get the tattoo, you're always going to have one free intro level plan. Like, why do we need to have these, we're just going to collect your data and have massive surveillance of you and sell everything to advertisers? Why do we bother with that when we could just like offer people to get like a tattoo of your company?
It's free advertising.
That's how you pay for your Google searches or whatever it is.
Oh, yeah.
So that's an interesting topic. I really think that there's so much more nuance there than frequently gets discussed. And like I said, I just kept hearing this over and over and over again from even wildly different folks, that this meme was just propagated around. So I wanted to kind of cover the other side.
Well, and I think that that's important to note, because one of the friends that I mentioned here, who started the carpentry business, he repeated that meme to me, and
So even this guy that
Yeah.
went off and started his own business, like got off unemployment
Yeah.
and everything, was still in this same way of thinking.
And I had to
Yeah.
check it, because he was complaining about the increase in lumber prices, and he made a comment about like, oh, no one wants to work. And I called him on it, and I said,
What does that have to do with the price of lumber, though?
It doesn't have anything. There's weevils in Canada.
1 + 1 = 3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and a lot of wood gets imported from Canada, and you're seeing the built-up effects of a supply crunch, and those Trump tariffs, like those pricing increases, are finally catching up with us. So that's why you see them on steel and wood and things that are coming in from Canada. Like, it's because there's been
From other
tariffs.
countries,
Yeah, there's been tariffs on those things for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, just wait until you see what happens next with oil. At
Right.
least my forecast, I can't take any credit for it. Cuppy pretty much is the one that came up with it, but I'm agreeing. I think this forecast that oil is going to go completely batshit, especially with the Biden admin shutting down production and basically making an incredibly hostile environment for the companies. And for the record, I don't like fossil fuel. I think we need to decarbonize, but you also have to realize we have a dependence on it, and we're going to get it from somewhere. So at any rate, yeah, I think everything's going to get more expensive.
Yeah, I mean, I think you also have to point out, I mean, when you look at lobbying and that sort of thing, I mean, the oil companies turn their money back into essentially buying the government. So if the government,
it's sort of a fair pendulum swing back to the other side, right? They did have a very easy time, and especially, oh my God, out in the oil patch the past 10 years, it's just been a perfect place to incinerate capital, if that's what you like to do.
Yeah. Like, and it's just a perpetual money machine, and it never slows down. And so there's no incentive.
Even with the Biden admin doing what they're doing, the domestic producers will probably be fine. They might not.
Yeah.
They won't go bankrupt.
I think that it touches on something that was going on during the pandemic, talking about dispelling memes, right? Was they kept the meatpacking plants open, right? And everyone was real worried about, like, oh, there's going to be a meat shortage. Like, there's these outbreaks in the factories. Like, we got to keep these people working, blah, 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 blah. And at the same time, because a few years ago, a bunch of pigs in China died because a pig flu swept through and a swine flu swept through.
And they had massive pork inflation.
Yeah. And so because the prices were so much better in China, even in the midst, and this would have been last summer 2020, in the midst of people in the media being like, oh no, like there's going to be a meat shortage, 1 in 3 American hogs was being sent to China. So you can't, you know what I mean? You can't export 1 out of every 3 pigs that you process and then claim that there's a shortage. Like, it's all just, you know what I mean? It's just an excuse to raise prices. Like, it's not, it's an artificially created crisis.
Right.
That people have a moneyed interest in perpetuating.
Yeah, and you'll see a complicated dynamic with that play out with, say, oil, for instance, where the higher the price goes, the more the temptation to ramp up production is. And people like to say high prices take care of high prices, because that naturally boosts production. Also, generally, I think people are going to consume less when the prices are high. So that, again, is a depressant effect. And by the way, even though I think the prices are probably going up, everyone listening, that doesn't mean that rates are also going up. I think rates could still go down. That's just a finance wonk nerd note. So at any rate, that's a lot of really interesting stuff about your experience recovering from the pandemic in terms of work. And one of the things that I also wanted to talk to you about in terms of the view from Main Street is what the kids are all doing these days on their Wall Street bets. They're trying to make some tendies.
Indeed.
And
give me them tendies, mommy.
They are YOLOing calls, gamma squeezing these tickers. Like AMC was the big one from last week that everyone was standing around with their mouth open looking at what was happening. And also the kids are dumping their money into the bitcoins.
Correct.
The bitcoins and the cryptos.
I think, and just kind of, again, anecdotally, from the people that I talk to who do things like that, one of the prevailing sentiments is fuck banks. Like, and what you're seeing is a generation of people who are now in their late 20s and early 30s who maybe their family lost their house in 2009, or they experienced some sort of hard times growing up because of the financial crunch of 2009, and of 2009. And so a decade later, now that those people are adults and in the workforce, you see people who want revenge. I saw a meme that I think really kind of perfectly encapsulates it, and it's from the Dark Knight movie when the Joker lights the pile of money on fire. And that was a meme that was going around in connection with this GME thing, and it captures the sentiment of a lot of people. This idea of no, if you blow this up, we're all going to lose money, and it's kind of one of those like, I don't have any money anyway, like so, you know what I mean? So if I light $1 on fire and that dollar lights 100 of yours on fire, like good, like you know what I mean? Like you're still losing way more than me because you have more to lose. So it's people,
Right, but I mean,
yeah.
with the meme stocks in particular, because crypto, I do think you're touching on. There is an underlying current that is the same thing there, which you mentioned and put it elegantly as "fuck banks."
Yeah.
We all saw banks, and that kind of became the definition of evil for us when Zach and I are both millennials. We're in our 30s, where we just associated banks evil,
Right,
essentially,
right.
and so. I can definitely see the crypto be your own bank kind of thing as part of that. But then also, do people not realize that there's like a hedge fund on the other side of these trades and these meme stocks that are also squeezing the other hedge funds and making tons of money? Like, how do they justify that?
Some people do, but I don't think most do.
So it's really just more of a populist, well-meaning but a little off-target kind of sentiment.
Correct, because what you're talking about retail traders, or you're talking about people who have a few hundred, maybe $1,000, and are trading through Robinhood or some sort of app, and so they're not financial experts. I mean, they're probably people who either didn't go to college or never took a finance class in college. Like, so it's not people who are operating with any sort of wealth of expertise. But I also think for a good portion of them, and I would say that because I bought some GME in January, and so I'm included in this, where it's kind of like, yeah, I don't care if I'm going to make money. I only care that you will lose money. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
you just want to squeeze somebody.
Yeah.
Even if there's another hedge fund who's also squeezing that hedge fund, at least one hedge fund went under.
Yeah.
And I also think that, I don't know if this is playing into this most recent round of stuff, but I find it absolutely ridiculous that all these people who touched the stove and got their hand horribly burned and horribly charred now are just went out and shorted all those same names again. I mean, that situation with GME where the short interest, I don't know if it still is, but it was over 100%, completely synthetic, over 100% afloat. I mean, and what the hell? Like, it makes sense that people want to strike back. They're trying to gamma squeeze these people by buying calls, which is pretty funny. They have now figured out that market makers have to hedge, and they are now having to buy shares and contribute to the squeeze.
Well, and a lot of that started from just a handful of Reddit users, and one of those main Reddit users, I know, and I'm not sure enough about the names and stuff, so I don't want to be wrong. But I do remember one of the Reddit users, like that was the whole thing. Like they bought $50,000 of GME in like October of 2019 or something like that, or 2020. They had bought a bunch of stocks in months before, and then they were the one who basically made a Reddit post that was just like, hey, if you all throw a few $100s on this, if you all like, here's it was just someone who was literally just like, this is over leveraged, like here's an opportunity. And then it caught fire. And then when it actually started working, that's when it caught fire of this idea of like a working man's revolution. Do you know what I mean? It was a way to poke the giant in the eye.
It certainly is there's a sense of community about it. I think that people, definitely people who hold these things and they just never sell them, even when GME went down 50% or however much it went down, it seemed like they identify, and even there's a meme about people being apes. Apes strong together. So
diamond hand monkeys to the moon.
Yeah, that's a symbol of something. It's a way of obtaining community, and I think that's what people miss a little bit too about it, is that they just think, oh, these dumb goofy kids, they're just losing their money and they're just using a casino, which is true.
But, well, and some people are and some people aren't. Myself, for example, I mean, my mother passed away a few years ago and left me an inheritance and da-da-da. So I had a couple grand that I could afford to throw away on GME, and that's exactly what I did. Was I bought and held so that other people who weren't in my position could cash out. Like that was, you know what I mean? And in that way, it was almost like a helping hand. Do you know what I mean? Hey, you're taking these billionaires' money. They deserve to have it taken, and I've got $1,000 that I could afford to lose, so that you can take some of their money. Like, yeah,
you're sort of allying yourself with these huge whales that, at least I think if you're sharp enough, what's really going on is hedge funds are at war against each other.
Yeah.
And GME and AMC and all these stocks are the battleground. I think it's hilarious that people have managed to convince themselves that they're somehow kind of sticking it to the man by buying these shit coin stocks.
Yeah.
Right there, the equivalents of shit coins.
Yeah.
They're penny stocks, kind of. And although there is some value plays in there, GME in particular, I think people really deeply believe in their ability to generate a ton of growth and come back from this Corona shutdown.
Yes, but I also think that one of the big sentiments behind it, and you kind of touched on this, where it's like, I was 19 in 2009 when the market crashed and all these banks and a bunch of people lost their houses. A lot of people went through some very difficult times, and none of the people who perpetrated that had any negative like no one went to jail,
right.
Like no one had to give any money back. And you have an entire generation of people who grew up just watching a bunch of billionaire criminals just wave their billionaire crimes in our faces. And so I think that's where it may not be working, but that's where the sentiment comes from, is, well, if the powers that be aren't going to hold these people accountable, like we gotta do something.
We're gonna at least try to body some of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what it's a reflective of a desire to do that. Now, how effective that is definitely debatable. But I
suspect we haven't seen the last of it.
Oh, no.
This kind of shareholder activism at a retail level, I think is going to continue to be important. And I almost even am inclined to wax philosophical and think maybe some of this migration to crypto will be part of that, because it will decentralize, take a lot of power. The people who are losing the most money or like missing out the most are the institutional investors. They move too slow to get into this new asset class. But one thing I did want to also touch on in a sentiment check in that way is, I think one thing you mentioned recently is, like, with crypto, all the people who are aggressively telling you about it are just all the exact wrong people.
Correct.
Right. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, I see in real life the reflective of kind of the same trends you see online, where it's like, I have a friend who's very heavily into crypto and likes to talk about it. He's also a man in his 40s, like, who works in restaurants, like, and also like repeats the talking points of a bunch of like alt-right internet figures. And he's a big Elon Musk fanboy. Do you know what I mean? Where it's like he literally fits.
So this guy was already cringe, and then he kind of comes up to you at work one day. You get that skeeved out, oh God, XYZ is talking to me feeling, and he goes, hey, have you ever heard of Bitcoin?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And also, because I didn't see him for like a year, and I ran into him again recently, and this would have, I don't know, like April, right, maybe. And and he was basically repeating everything, you know what I mean, where he was suddenly talking about, like, oh, I'm investing in stocks and I'm into Bitcoin, and like, oh, check out what I got going on my Robinhood app and blah, blah. And he never used to talk about that sort of thing. It also became clear after talking to him for about 10 minutes that he did not know what he was talking about, which I think is indicative, throwing a bunch of money away, and he likes to talk big, but he doesn't really know what he's doing.
Right. And then you mentioned there was one friend who was just talking about crypto all the time. Seemed like from the outside, if at least you listened to just his words, he was doing awesome. But then it
was the same conversation where he was talking about stocks and talking about how he'd gone in big on crypto and all this stuff. And with having invested with the stuff that Mom left me, it's like, I'm no expert, but I know enough to be like, I don't think you're right about that.
You know the ropes.
Yeah. Or at least know it broad strokes enough to know that, like, you don't know what you're talking about. And then, so 5 minutes after he'd gotten done talking about how well he was doing in crypto and blah, 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 he mentioned needing to get a haircut for his eviction proceeding, like for his Zoom eviction proceeding. And I didn't say it to him directly, but it struck me that I was like, how can you be doing so well in crypto and like making all this money on Robinhood and doing all well trading stocks if you're getting evicted? Like, you know what I mean? Like, so it raises the question of, is he's either lying, you know what I mean, or he's not prioritizing correctly, you know what I mean? Like, so Yeah.
Right. Just like being house poor, there I think
Yeah.
are some individuals who are out there and they're crypto poor. They could sell some of their crypto and be fine, pay for the
Yeah.
rent or whatever, but literally they're out there prioritizing buying cryptos, Bitcoin, and all this stuff over basic needs that are low on Maslow's pyramid.
Yeah.
So,
I
one
mean,
final topic that I wanted to conclude on was we talked a bit about how Louisville was such a hotbed of activity politically
yeah,
in 2020. And so why don't
still
you tell
is.
us a little bit about where the city's come from and where you see it today?
Well, so Louisville became a focus because of the Brianna case, which happened in March of 2020, if I remember correctly. And there was already a bit going on around that. I actually, at one point in April of last year, accidentally joined a car protest about the Brianna case. I was driving home from my father-in-law's house, and I pulled into traffic, and it was a slow-moving line of cars, and people were honking, and then I realized that they were holding up handwritten signs out of their cars about the Brianna case, and I had actually, because it wasn't a big thing when it initially happened, so this was a month later, and I had only recently become aware of it. And then once the George Floyd video came out, Louisville, that's when it really coalesced. And part of what happened was from the get go. I mean, the first night that there was a protest, they came to an intersection. The cops closed in on four sides and closed people in. So people started breaking windows to escape the police ring by going through the businesses, which of course the next day became a story of, oh, look at all these violent looters that came into downtown and shattered all these windows and blah blah blah. And that's not what happened.
They were just trying to escape.
Yeah, yeah, because the police came in so aggressively, and then they summoned the National Guard. And I mean, 3 days into the protest, the National Guard rolled into the west end of the city and shot David McAtee.
Right. Yeah. You told me all this, and
Yeah,
I hate to admit I hadn't even heard of this. So
yeah.
why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about what happened there?
Okay. Well, and again, I was not there, so I only know, what I know from living in the city. I don't have any. I just want to make clear.
Yeah.
It's not like I was a firsthand witness to this.
You weren't
or anything.
there.
Correct.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was now. See, earlier in the day, I was at a protest earlier in the day because they had instituted a curfew, which pissed a lot of people off. And I had been in a protest earlier that day where they were like, oh, well, we got to clear the crowd for the curfew. And then they tear gassed us an hour early. Like they started tear gassing people an hour before the curfew even kicked in. The state troopers were out there with big smiles on their face, like shooting rubber bullets at teenagers. They were just having a great old time with it. And that's what I mean. They weren't even enforcing the curfew because it was an hour early. But so then later that night, there were people still out and about in the West End at this David McAtee. He ran a barbecue stand. So he was there smoking meat for the next day, right? Because it's one of those things. If you're going to smoke meat for 12 hours, you got to start it at midnight so it's ready at noon, right?
Yeah.
So he was at his business. Like it's not even, you know what I mean?
He was running his business.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's worth pointing out that, yeah, he was violating curfew, but he was at his business on his own private property. Cops rolled in. It's not really clear what happened, but they just started shooting and they shot and killed David McAtee. Now they claim he had a gun. I'm disinclined to believe them.
And well, you said that the people who were there said that he really just had a pair of tongs.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Yeah.
Is the story that I've heard. And there is security footage, camera footage, but it's from a building across the street and it's a security camera. So it's very grainy.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to say. And the police didn't even identify themselves. So if he did have a gun,
could have just been anyone.
Right, because the police rolled into the parking lot and just started shooting pepper balls at everybody to clear. You know what I mean? They literally just rolled in from the dark. You know what I mean? Like there's a street light on the parking lot and they literally just come running out of the dark as a line, just shooting pepper balls at people. Yeah. So he might have thought that it was a drive-by. You know what I mean? Like, even if he did pull a gun, why are the police just charging into parking lots, indiscriminately pepper balling people? And then they left his body sit out in the parking lot for almost an entire day. And that sticks with me, not just because it's a horrible thing, but because a couple days earlier, I'd been listening to a speaker and he said something essentially to that effect where he was like, that's what an exterminator does. They'll kill one of them and then you leave it out for everybody to see.
Right.
get the message across. And then 2 days later, they shot McAtee at his business, left his body sit there for at least for 12, 14 hours.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I had literally heard a speaker predict them do that they were going to do something like that 2 days earlier. And that's that's why it really struck me.
It's kind of the proverbial head on a pike.
Correct. So, and then that's when the daily marches started. But it's worth noting that not a lot of rioting, right? Like, it gets caught up in this narrative of the riot and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I remember...
Just like the lazy people thing, right? There's this meme that's going around that I'm all for peaceful protests, but rioters and looters, that's not okay.
Well, and the way that it'll get framed is it's like, you have 400 people marching down the street, one guy like picks up a pipe and breaks a window, and the narrative becomes 400 people came through breaking windows, right? When it's
trying to steal Xboxes.
Right. But it's where it's like one person breaking windows as part of a group of hundreds of people somehow becomes a narrative of, oh, well, they're all doing it.
Well, and there's all sorts of potential psyops, disinformation, intel kind of stuff, potential stuff going on, right? Where how do we know who that was that started breaking windows?
Yeah. And it's worth noting that I mean, I'm talking about an actual incident that I saw, and the cops moved into the crowd and arrested that guy. Do you know what I mean? Like,
and probably no one was stopping them. Right. I mean, and all the protesters said, "Well, you did break a window."
Well, and at that point, getting into a physical confrontation with the cops.
Well, especially with the cops being so aggressive anyway.
Exactly. They're in full riot gear and they're holding a club. 4 of them grabbed this kid. I mean, he was a kid. If I had to guess, he's probably about 17. But yeah, like 4 of them grabbed this kid. And it's like, what are you going to do? Like, you going to run over and fight 4 cops and catch like felony assault charges 4 times over? Like,
what was that
he'll be out of jail tomorrow. Like,
what was that you were telling me though about? I think you told me some story about how there were these guys that were just kind of looking for trouble, and you were a little suspicious that it could have been someone who just wanted to stir things up and kind of discredit the protesters, guys that were looking to fight or something like that. Or am I misremembering?
Well, there were a couple instances like that where, because they would arrest people en masse, right? They would just grab 100 people and arrest them. And so then the crowds would be outside the next day. There would be legal defenders, and there was like, we were doing like a get out of jail team thing where you come out of jail and there's like a bag of lunch and a bottle of water waiting for you, that kind of thing. And here's a lawyer's card, like they want to take your case for free, like because they're mad the police are doing this and they want to fight the police for free on your behalf. So there were a couple times where they would let people out of jail, and then they would just leave. Like, they wouldn't stay and interact. They didn't want to be on camera. They would hide their faces from the live streamers and stuff. And there are legitimate reasons to do that, but there were a couple times where you're kind of like, that was weird.
Yeah.
Like, that was weird. Like,
yeah. So how about the city today? I mean, do you think it's still just kind of one more case from boiling over again, or where did everything land?
Oh yeah. No, I mean, the city hasn't really been responsive to really anything. I mean, the state passed this Brianna law that bans no-knock warrants. I mean, on a knocking warrant, you only have to wait 30 seconds before you kick in the door. So you literally, the difference is now you got to knock and wait 30 seconds before you can kick in the door. Like, instead of just kicking in the door without knocking. So
right, pretty empty gesture.
Yeah. And at the same time, they passed a law criminalizing protesting. If you're arrested at a protest, they'll charge you with rioting. And then if you're charged with rioting, you no longer qualify for state benefits.
And I think you told me they made a "don't be mean to the police" law.
Yeah, they suspended the First Amendment. If you say something mean to a police officer...
Well, hang on. Let me first pause here. This characterization of it saying that it's suspended the First Amendment, like, is that verbiage in the bill?
No, that's just how I like to...
So that is a colorful interpretation.
That is.
Just to be clear.
Yeah.
So, yes, okay.
Well,
so that's your opinion about what it is. Maybe it is correct.
Well, so the language of the bill is basically that the cops can arrest you and you can be charged $250 for insulting them, but
which is a lot of money in Kentucky, by the way.
Yeah, but the cops are also allowed to decide for themselves what constitutes an insult.
So it's just if you insult the cops,
it's if
that is now a crime.
If the cop decides that you insulted them.
Well, who else is going to decide? They're making the arrest.
Right, but
Yeah.
that's what I mean. The language of the bill doesn't even specify any sort of standard. It's and actually there is
It literally just, let's see if we can pull it up.
yeah, but it's and actually there is language in there where it says that not only does the cop get to decide what constitutes an insult, but that a police officer's definition of what considers an insult may be lower than a normal person's. Yeah, so Nathan's pulling it up right now. But so they increased the city increased the police budget in June of 2020.
Here it is. Here it is. This is completely unconstitutional. In my opinion, I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. In my opinion, this is fucking bullshit. This is completely unconstitutional. But listen to what the actual verbiage of this bill that was passed by the Kentucky Senate says. A person is guilty of disorderly conduct in the second degree when in a public place and with intent to cause public inconvenience, annoyance, or alarm, or wantonly creating a risk thereof. He, I guess they're just leaving women out of this, costs, insults, taunts, or challenges a law enforcement officer with offensive or derisive words, or by gestures or other physical contact that would have a direct tendency to provoke a violent response from the perspective of a reasonable and prudent person. I mean, that is terrible. That is so broad. That
so if you call a cop a fucker, and normally they would punch you in the face when they're off duty, they're allowed to arrest you on duty. Is basically what that's saying.
Yikes. I mean, that is just absolutely anti-constitution.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's a reason that we call it Kentuckistan.
They also have other things in here. I won't go into the whole bill. Maybe I'll link it in the comments or something if people would like to go check it out. But this also is just so incredibly broad. A person is guilty of disorderly conduct in the second degree when in a public place, the same thing from before, they engage in fighting or in violent, tumultuous, or threatening behavior. They make unreasonable noise.
Yeah.
So they're going to arrest the fucking cicadas?
Yeah.
They really need to, because those fuckers are loud.
Yeah.
Or they refuse to obey an official order to disperse issued to maintain public safety in dangerous proximity to a fire hazard or other emergency. What?
Yeah.
I mean, people have a right to assemble. It's literally in the Constitution. And,
No.
you know, they try to say, oh, it's an emergency or a hazard. That could be anything.
Look, Nathan, look. The LMPD are delicate snowflakes.
Exactly.
And we have to turn all of Kentucky into a safe zone to protect their delicate snowflake feelings.
There you go. The Kentucky police are just so incredibly triggered.
Yes.
And they cannot manage their emotions.
That's
They have
true.
not been to therapy.
That's true.
We know this is true. They're so easily triggered, and they're so sensitive that even if we make unreasonable noise, we might upset them.
Yes.
So if you're beatboxing, you could get arrested.
Yeah.
If you shout, if you talk to your friend even a little bit too loud, you could get arrested.
Yeah, don't laugh too loudly because you're creating unwanted noise.
Unreasonable noise. Unreasonable noise could make you guilty of disorderly conduct in the second degree.
Yeah. Well, it's like
if you're wantonly creating a risk thereof of public inconvenience.
Yeah.
So I mean, of course, this is meant to shut down things like shutting down the road for a protest or basically anything that's actual political action.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's enough of that.
Yeah.
But in closing, I mean, this has been a lot of great stuff. I love that I can get this view from Main Street from you because I'm just this super privileged techie guy who happened to luck out and like know how to code and everything. I did work hard, but that's not, it's still a very privileged position. And so what I would like to conclude on, I always like to ask people this. Let's say that you're a young person, 22, 23, and you're just entering adulthood, you're entering your career. What advice would you give to someone in that position?
If I'm being perfectly frank, and I don't want to get too into the weeds or be too alarmist, but I think that there are a lot of parallels between what's going on here in America and what happened in the first half of the 20th century in a lot of European countries. And I would say that move to another country. You know what I mean? Either find an opportunity at a company that allows you to travel or move internationally, or even start a business somewhere else or buy a cheap piece of land somewhere. But I'm going to stay here and continue to fight. But I mean, like the bills that the bill that we were just discussing, like I'm worried about the rise of anti-freedom in America, to be honest.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that's valid feedback. It's something that probably seems insane to people our parents' age, where they think America is the best. It's never going to ever be any better anywhere in the world. I mean, I
Right.
remember I went to Europe, and when I got back, my parents, not to put them on blast, but I thought this was hilarious. They asked me, "Did it make you appreciate everything that you have in America, all the special privileges that you enjoy being American?" I was kind of like, "Well, I didn't go to a third world country. I went to Germany,
Right.
and it was
Right.
perfectly reasonable. The sodas were a bit smaller, but
Right.
otherwise it was kind of the same."
Right.
And so I think it's something that America in general needs to think about. How much is too much, and
Yeah.
people are going to leave. There's going to be a huge brain drain. For instance, not being welcoming to immigrants, that's going to cause major demographic issues.
Well, and I mean, some advice that I kind of think incorporates both of our things is Ireland right now is offering special privileges, relaxed standards to young people who want to move to Ireland because they've experienced such a brain drain. With the EU and the freedom of movement, a lot of young people left Ireland for bigger cities in Europe, and now Ireland is trying to attract young people because they have an aging population and they have a lot more older people than they do young people. Ireland is trying to attract young people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if we're not careful, that's what America will be doing.
Which is what we should be doing. Otherwise, the whole world is at risk of ending up like Japan, where the demographics are all screwed up, and you can't even afford all the older people because there aren't enough young people to be tax mules. So,
we need fry cooks.
There was an interesting
bunch of people on the border who would probably cook some fries.
Take that off.
I'm just saying.
There was a really interesting piece that I saw about how China has now revised their, I think it was a 2-child policy. Now you're allowed to have 3 children. Yeah. And part of that is because it's a panic move after they sort of screwed themselves so badly in terms of the demographics by not letting people have enough children.
Right.
And,
and then prioritizing boys over girls. Like that's a big part of it. I think it's something like don't quote me on this because it's been a minute, but I think the statistics are roughly like a 3-to-1 gender imbalance in China.
Yeah, I think I don't really know, but that's the word on the street.
Right. It was something like that where it's somewhere between 2-to-1 and 3-to-1 because the 1-child policy favored boys over girls for so many years. Yeah.
All righty. Well, thanks very much for coming on today, Zach. And before we go, anything you'd like to plug or promote?
No, not necessarily at the moment. I'm about to finish my real estate license. So here in a couple of weeks, if you're in the Louisville, Kentucky area and you're wanting to trade some property or you have a real estate job, let me know.
There you go. And we can link Zach's email in the comments. So thanks very much for coming on today, Zach.
Well, thanks for having me, Nathan. It was a lot of fun.
Happy to.